In this video, we will learn how to do a Mantuamaker's hem, which is essentially a seam that is self-encased and looks very much like a French seam. If you've ever seen a French seam before, you probably will confuse it as such. But the difference is that with a Mantuamaker's hem, we are literally hemming the seam. As always, please watch this video first and then go back and try your hands at it. The Workwoman's Guide in 1840 describes a mantuamaker's hem, and they say this is often used instead of sewing for bags and sleeves that have no linings or skirts of petticoats, etc. And the work is prepared as follows. Lay the raw edge of one piece a little below that of the other. Then turn the upper edge over the lower twice as in hemming and fell it securely down. So in this class, we are going to do a sample Mantuamaker's hem that can be applied to your unlined garments. Something that you might typically use, for example, a flat-felled seam or a French seam on. This is a great alternative and a very fast alternative to that technique. So now that we have our sample pieces cut along that length, what we're going to do is do a sample Mantuamaker's hem, as it was known, but it's really a seaming technique. I've marked my white linen with an R and a W so you can visualize where the wrong and the right side would be if you were using a pattern. So up top, I've got my wrong side, here is my right side, and in order to create this seam, we want to actually take the fabric and put the right sides together, but we want to stagger the raw edges the width of the seam allowance. So in this instance, I want my seam allowance to be a fourth of an inch or 7 centimeters. And well, the finished width of the seam allowance, I should say, because in all told, you're taking up double this. So you're actually taking up a half of an inch or about 1 centimeter. But here what I'm doing is making sure that these edges are lining up and then making sure that this is offset. Now you can use a seam gauge in order to do a nice measure and just double check. Another thing that I would recommend if you're using a fabric like linen or let's say like worsted wool, just a textile that you can really see the weave structure, is to find one yarn going across the fabric and then line that up as you're measuring. For basting, you might choose to use, say, a thread that you're not using any longer for construction. Like I'm using, for example, this polyester thread for basting because I don't like to sew my finished seams with polyester anymore. And I don't use a machine. And so I'm using some of that older machine thread to do my basting. So I'm going to take this raw edge right here and I'm going to fold it up just the width of that raw edge over top of the fabric. So what I'm doing is using my non-dominant hand to press this up. Don't forget your thimble. I'm pushing the needle down and then back up again to baste. Basting is a very easy stitch to do. It's a straight stitch. Basting itself, the running stitch that you use for it, is you're just doing like a straight stitch across. So I'm going to dip my needle down, pop it back up again, push it through, lock that needle or that knot into place. And I'm going to continue across the width here. I'm using my good ergonomic technique of pinching the needle with my thumb and my pointer finger. I've got my thimble here resting kind of to the back. And it's important to note that I actually am I'm holding the needle closer to the point. So I'm not holding it really far back here. I'm holding it closer to the front. So I have more control in that manner. My palm is facing down. And the work is somewhat parallel to my body. I'm going to dip the needle down. I'm going to pop this back up again. So it's like a fulcrum here, kind of rocking the needle up. And then you're using your non-dominant hand to hold the work so that can then connect with it. This is the same type of ergonomic technique we're going to use when we're actually felling our seams, when we're using that hem stitch or a felling stitch later on. So we're just going to do relatively large stitches just to temporarily hold that fold into place. These are going to be removed later. Again, I'm just pushing the needle down through the fabric. You can see how I'm just using the tip of my fingers to do that. And I'm really only working for like at the front, say fourth of that needle in order to engage with the textile, and then pushing with my middle finger here. Now, a note about tension. You can see how I have the work on the table And now I have enough of this space here that's been stitched. So I'm using my dominant hand to hold that work against the table, and I'm using my non-dominant hand to stabilize the work here. And so that allows for a good tension for good technique. You'll also note that as I'm pushing this through, I pick it up with my thumb and my pointer finger. I take my pinky finger and push it away from me. But what's actually happening is my whole entire arm is what is pushing that needle. I'm not using just my hand and I'm not using my wrist. So you want to get used to the idea of sewing with your whole arm versus your wrist. Now, keeping in mind that people hand sewed clothing for over 30,000 years before a sewing machine was even invented. And so there are very ergonomic, safe ways to do this technique. Now, here I am at the end. You can see my basting stitches are kind of wonky and wobbly, and that's absolutely fine because the whole point is temporarily holding this in place. I'm going to do a little bit of a back stitch. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go back to the stitch I just did, drop my needle up, kind of rock it forward, and then that's going to lock that in place. And I'm going to go ahead and snip that off. I'm going to remove all of the pins that I had before because we don't need those anymore. So now we have our raw edge basted up. The next step is going to be folding this raw edge up once again, and then we're going to fell that in place or using a hem stitch. The most important thing about this seaming technique is that you go through all of the layers because the point is to stitch this fold to this fabric. And then eventually what's going to happen is this little seam allowance is going to stick up. It's going to look like a French seam if you're familiar with that, but the technique is done differently. This is the thread I'm going to use. It's Londonderry linen thread, 50/3. It's a relatively heavyweight linen. I like to typically stitch with 80/3 linen thread. The first number indicates the weight. So that means that it's going to be, if it's a lower number, it's going to be heavier weight, just like yarn. And then the secondary number indicates the ply. So that means there's 3 yarns that have been twisted together in order to make this linen thread. Now don't forget to wax this linen thread. So what I'm going to do is place my thread on my piece of wax and pull it over top. I like to wax it about, I would say 4 to 5 times. You want to make sure that any kind of fuzziness is coated when you wax it. The length of my thread is the length of my arm. All right, now to begin the actual seam, we're going to take our raw edges and we're going to go ahead and fold this up once. Then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to put it right along the edge here, a yarn or 2 away from that fold. I'm going to pull this up and that's going to then lock that knot into place. Using my non-dominant hand, I'm holding that fabric. So now to do my first stitch, I'm going to dip my needle a little bit to the left visually of where this tail is into the fabric itself, kind of right underneath where the fold is, dropping that down and then popping back up again in one continuous motion through the fold. So you can see how the needle is at, I would say about a 20-25 degree angle. Again, I'm going through this fabric and then I'm going through this fold and then I'm going to push that through. And so that's the first stitch I just made. Now I did go through all the layers. That's very important. And the angle of my needle, the way that I dipped it through, I'm putting my needle more kind of like this direction. I'm not going this direction. So let's do another stitch. So again, I'm going to the left of this tail visually because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you're going to go slightly to the right of that tail. So dipping that needle down a little bit underneath the fold. So again, underneath the fold, what it looks like is I'm dipping it down essentially like that, okay? So I'm dipping it down under the fold, grabbing the fabric, kind of pushing down just the tip of the needle, and then I'm rocking it back up again in the same manner we did with basting, and then I'm pushing it towards the fold. You know, it's only about a yarn or 2 away from that fold. Now, as you're doing this, you want to make sure that the weave structure, the weave structure of the textile of your fold is going in the same direction as the weave structure of the fabric here. Because otherwise, if you kind of push it to one side, by the time you get to the edge, you're going to have a seam allowance that's poking out. So you want to be also very mindful to make sure that everything is lining up. You can see how I'm really just using the tip of the needle and I'm really kind of utilizing my hands kind of closer to the front edge of the needle, dipping that down, popping that up, pushing it with my middle finger, pinching this, and then I'm going to pull it up with my whole arm, and then I'm going to continue along the way. A couple of things that beginners sometimes do that you might be doing is you might be stitching, again, kind of like this. You might be overcompensating and kind of grabbing a ton of fabric and kind of popping it back up again. You don't want to do that because if you do that, you're not going to be able to open up the seam and have a clean seam line. If you end up kind of rocking it, you will eventually have kind of a weird seam grin. So you want to be careful to make sure you're just going through that fold. And you have a little bit of stitching on the other side. So I'm just going to do some stitches so you can really see the rhythm that can be created when we do this and how that's going to look like from the other side. So my needle is really parallel to the edge of the work. Again, we're not going this direction, we're holding it like this. That's very important. So now from the underside, you can really see the directionality of those stitches, how they really are going from right to left. If you're left-handed, you're going to be working left to right. So if I were to open this up, again, you can really see how there's like a clean seam, and you've got your seam allowance right here. So this would be on the inside of the work. This is the outside. Again, it's marked with the right side, right? This is the right side of the work. So let's just continue to practice and do all the way across here. You might be using lightweight to medium weight cotton. You might be using a lightweight to medium weight worsted wool, linens, silk even. It's great for that. And it's cool because all you're doing is just hemming the fabric. You just have to remember to go through all the different layers. So now I've switched the view so that you can see what my hands look like as I'm referring to the idea of using your arm to sew versus your wrist. So again, I'm using the table to stabilize the work, and then my hands are pinching this fabric. I put the needle into the fabric here. I pinch it with my thumb and forefinger, and then I take my pinky and I flick this out to the side. So essentially the whole motion is going to be like a figure eight or like an infinity sign. And I'm sitting in a chair that's really straight backed. I'm not slouched over. I'm sitting up relatively straight, but I'm still very relaxed, and I'm trying to keep my hands relaxed. So if I kind of go over here, you might be able to start to see this motion. So I'm just going to continue on along the way until the thread gets a little bit shorter. But this is why we only have our thread be the length of our arm, so that we can then grab it and come back instead of going all the way out and not having that point. It really helps with tension because you're going to stitch, pull it out, and then you'll feel the work. You'll feel that resistance, and then you'll say, a little bit of resistance, and then I can come back to the work again. So I'm going to put my work more out here, really, so you can see that. So I'm coming out here. This is connecting with my pinky, and then I'm returning to the work. So this is the position that my hand is in, slightly curled, but still relaxed. Again, hand sewing has been done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You can do it quickly and efficiently, but it is a practice. So now back at this view, we're going to go ahead and finish off this edge, and we're going to go ahead and knot it off. I just want to really reiterate that, this is a practice. This is not a skill that you necessarily are going to be able to just pick up and know how to do unless you've already had some time with the needle and thread before. Maybe you've quilted or done some cross stitch. The garment construction technique is slightly different than those, but you still will have that practice with the dexterity of holding needle and thread. I tell people to hand sew for as little as 10 minutes a day, and after say a month of sewing for 10 minutes a day, it'll start to feel more natural, and you'll really start to get the hang of it. I mean, it might start to feel natural after a week of just 10 minutes, but it is a practice, so you really do have to do it kind of consistently. So you can see here there the hem that's been laid in, and then the underside has that beautiful top stitch. Now, if you're a beginner, it might look a little wonky, and that's okay. Just keep on practicing. Now, to knot off here at the end, what I like to do is take a little bit of a bite of the fabric, and then I'm going to pull this through, and I've got a loop, so I can put my needle through that loop once because the thread's slightly heavy. If it was lighter weight, I would go ahead and do it twice, and that's making a knot. And then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to drop it in between the layers of the fold and this fabric, pull it through. So what that will do is hide the knot and then make it look like a stitch. And then I'm going to gently pull on the tail and snip this off. And once you're done with your seaming, you can take your basting out, because again, this is temporary. So I just like to take my small scissors and just go ahead and cut that and pull this out here at the other side, kind of pulling out. If you have a seam ripper, you can do the same thing. I just like to use my little scissors though. So now that we have our basting out, you can see what the seam looks like. Again, this is known as a Mantuamaker's hem in the early 19th century in English texts. And you can see the other side again with that top stitching. So if we open it up, we've got the cross section here. This is the raw edge. This is that have been encased. And this fold section, that's going to be on the interior of the work. And this is going to be the outside. So again, this is the right side of the work. So it makes a really clean, beautiful hem, or seam, I should say, right? And it can be used in place of your French seams, and it can be used on garments that are unlined. I would suggest using a smaller seam allowance, especially if you're going under the armhole. So again, only using about 1/4 of an inch or even smaller if the fabric can stand that. So I look forward to seeing what garments you create with your newfound skill of sewing up a Mantuamaker's hem. Congratulations!